So, welcome to Merakoi Voices. It's our podcast where we speak with leading patient experts in all things about co-design and especially looking at how to bridge the gap between healthcare innovation and patient inputs and patient perspectives. And so we're looking today at clinical trial co-design, something that's very near and dear to our hearts, and I think a new trend in particular about looking at patients' perspectives very early in the research and development process. So I'm joined by Ella Balasa. She's a patient expert and an advocate and has many, many years of experience as an advocate speaking before quite senior policymakers, health, as well as on the side, I believe you've been doing quite a bit of consultancy. And so we're going to focus in particularly on the consultancy aspects. Ella has been a member of the Merakoi network for many years and has been always active and participated in some of the back channel work that we've done to build the community. So thanks, Ella, for joining us. Yeah, we'll jump right in. I think the first thing is, as I said, we want to look at co-design in clinical trials. And maybe the first question for you is, what led you to become a champion of co-design in trials?
Certainly. Well, again, thank you for having me on this podcast. It's great to be part of the Merakoi family and for a number of years now. I really started my advocacy journey in my mid-20s when I was starting to experience increasing symptoms of my disease, cystic fibrosis, and also having experience working with science background. I was working in a microbiology lab. And so I was realizing that there was this bridge that I could make between patients and the research community and how I could kind of help empower and support patients in understanding more about research and in distilling that kind of information. And then also being this voice on research committees and panels that are developing clinical trial designs and making healthcare more accessible and better for patient participation. And so it was through, evolution of my involvement initially just with the cystic fibrosis community, where I was tasked on a number of these committees, as I said, and bringing the patient perspective to clinical trial design or protocol design development, into thinking about where are there existing gaps and needs, both in clinical care and in the research side for cystic fibrosis, where there should be still where there's a gaps and needs for innovation and improvement for the cystic fibrosis community. And so that's where really my advocacy voice started. I also have been a clinical trial participant in that I've received experimental treatments and really wanted to voice those experiences for other patients to understand and learn more about what it means to not just be a trial participant, but how to seek out opportunities and be a voice for themselves. So, and from that point, it really started, I started to, have a name in the patient engagement, patient advocacy world, and started speaking at conferences, and just one thing led to another. And now I'm doing consultancy with companies. I sit on a lot of patient advisory boards and also independently help companies think about how they can connect with their targeted patient communities and meaningfully connect with the population and develop trust, transparency, and just really in that co-design of research and in care.
Yeah, you mentioned your actual participation in the clinical trial and how that kind of led you to do further things in this space. And I think that's often the case with a lot of people, that the actual experience of being in a trial is a motivator to, help out with improving future trials for others. So I just maybe on that point, why do you think that co-design of trials with patients is important? I'm looking at it from the trial sponsor side.
I always say that it is truly a mutual benefit for both sponsors and for patient communities, in the sense that when a sponsor is seeking true integration of or co-design and co-development with patients, they gain a better understanding of starting from the research question, what is important for patients to study? Where do they need? How can a certain treatment fit into their lives and improve their quality of life? How can it do that the best way possible? How can a clinical trial support not only, get information as far as like how a certain drug is affecting a population, but how it can best support them in their clinical care too, and in gathering data that they can then use after the trial and take back to their physician. So it's like there's different considerations for why it's important to gain this patient co-design and development. And industry is ultimately creating a solution, whether that's a drug, whether it's a product, that is best suited to the patient population. And then that's going to then facilitate either better recruitment efforts for a trial. It's going to, or if it's post-market, it's going to facilitate uptake of a drug or treatment. And similarly for patients, when a company seeks that patient input, we feel like we are part of making something better for our community, improving the lives of others in our community and ourselves. And it's a very meaningful endeavor because obviously we live with these conditions day in and day out. And when a company is truly committed to improving our lives and considering what our needs are and how these burdens can be lifted even just a little bit, it is meaningful and it's impactful. And so that's also helping to develop that relationship and build that trust on our end. So that's why I always say that it's this mutual benefit.
You mentioned some things that are very much going down the road of it's ethically important to involve people in the trial, especially the people who will be most impacted, but also on the very practical side, you mentioned something else, which I think we can touch on in a moment, is a lot of trials and therapies coming to market out of trials will be for very specific patient populations, right? It's not just the general public or the general population anymore. It's much more targeted and precise. And often that is reflected in trial inclusion, exclusion criteria and who's actually able to participate.
Right.
If you're a researcher, how would you approach that? Because one of the issues that they're seeing is trials are maybe too exclusive, and then you don't reach the people that you want to have in the trial and that ultimately will be served.
I certainly have a personal experience to highlight here. So I mentioned before it was an expanded access trial. So that was really just an N of 1 study. It was not an FDA approved therapy and also not in a randomized control trial either. And when it comes to new investigational drugs trials, I have not had the opportunity to participate in these. There have been a number of advancements in cystic fibrosis these last number of years, and specifically there was a drug approved for CF 5 years ago that treats the underlying cause of the disease. However, at the time I was unable to participate because I have very low lung function, and one of the exclusion criteria is any patient that has below 40% FEV1, which is a measure of lung function. And having lived majority of my adult life, having more advanced lung disease, meaning below 40% FEV1, I was excluded from all of these trials. And so that is something that I really strongly advocate for at this point too, is that how can companies really think about being more broadly inclusive of different various disease manifestations? Like there are varying degrees of how a patient is affected by a certain disease, which I understand some of the reasons why they have these exclusion criteria. It's to prevent potential negative adverse events and such, but it's really, and as we, even as the FDA is now really strongly pushing for diversity in trial design and the need for diversity action plans, there is this strong focus in being more inclusive in trials, and really that how important that is, because then there's an enormous population of patients that there is no information on how a certain drug would react or improve or affect that population. And, in my case specifically, having low lung function is potentially a factor that would mean that I wouldn't see as much improvement on any given drug because of much lower starting point of lung function. But there's also this group of patients, now I'm talking about CF specifically, that have a lot of stability in our health, even living with a lower level of lung function, that could very meaningfully benefit from potentially a trial and also contribute valuable data. And so I really urge the need for developing adaptive trial designs where there are separate arms of studies to capture data from patients that may be outside of the typical inclusion-exclusion criteria. With the advent of a lot of remote technology, wearables and other sensors and technologies, we're really able to capture nuance and just very specific granular details about a person's day-to-day life that maybe in thinking about, and now this is kind of touching on another topic, is development of different endpoints that can more meaningfully capture what is important for that person on a day-to-day basis. For example, like for me, my lung function doesn't change considerably, even from year to year, let alone day to day. And so it's not really a meaningful measure of how I'm doing on a day-to-day basis. I could have the same lung function from one day to another, but also feel really full of mucus in my lungs and not breathing well one day, just have a hard time walking a block or two. Whereas another day I could have very similar lung function, which I do, and be able to do that and walk with no problem. And so that to me is a more meaningful measure in my day-to-day life. And so, how we can use these technologies moving forward and advance and think about digital endpoints and how there's just that shapes and changes the way that we're developing these trials. And so that's really something that I urge strongly. Just quickly, another example without talking, I know I'm talking a long time, but on the digital endpoints topic, I have a colleague who is a parent of a person living with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and they have clinical outcome assessment in Duchenne that measures various parameters on the mobility and function of a person as it's a neuromuscular condition. And so one of the tests measures whether they can the sit to stand. So, if they're able, how easily they're able to come to a standing position on a scale of like 0 to 2, meaning 0, you can't do it at all. 2 is you do it with no problem. She was saying that her son, like if he puts a hand on his leg while he's trying to get to a standing position, that is 1 point less because you're not able to do it as easily. However, she says that just putting a hand on a leg doesn't mean that it's any harder for them to stand up. So it's not really actually reflective of the difficulty of them doing that task. However, on a clinical outcome test, that would reduce the ability, right? It would reduce the value that test was scored. And so then when it comes to a trial, that could negatively affect the outcomes or the data. And so if we think about how there can be other evidence that's used, and maybe just a video, for example, that can capture longer duration of time, not just this one specific measure, mobility. So that's just another example.
Yeah, I know, amazing examples, and really to the sort of illustrates what I'm trying to discuss here about co-design and what the purpose of co-design. It's actually to get that rich, important data on things like quality of life and what really matters to patients. And, you mentioned endpoints as well. So we started with the inclusion, exclusion criteria, and we went to endpoints. And actually both are really important for people to consider, what does the patient actually need there, and
right.
Who defines that? Have you seen good examples, or, do you have thoughts on how to actually design those endpoints?
Well, I guess I'm not a statistician or any sort of expert. So all I can say is that, it's important to connect to the community and seek out, advisory panels and individuals that can share these experiences of what I just shared, so that there can be this collaborative effort in thinking about how there can be what metrics instead would be meaningful to patients, and how can that be captured effectively?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a good point, because you can let the statisticians figure out how to actually capture it, but what are you trying to capture in the first place is perhaps the more important thing. And maybe we could jump to the process of a trial. Like we've discussed getting into trial, what you're measuring in a trial, and then actually what happens now when you leave a trial. So that's I've heard often from patients that it's a kind of almost like a breakup at the end of a trial, where the relationship's dead and you get ghosted by text because you don't hear anything from the trial, and oftentimes it feels like just an abrupt end. Do you see that as well? And do you think there's things that we can do to improve that, and what would that be?
I mean, I think that happens more often than not. I think there's few examples where there is maybe a continuous relationship ongoing, check-ins at certain intervals. I think that should be the norm and should be the status quo, but it is few and far between, I think, as of now. But it really is important, after the trial, to not only maintain that relationship to some degree, but also the importance of returning data results. And that it signifies the value that participant had in that research, because giving something back to the patient, and it also helps them to take that information and have their, regular physician look at it, their specialist, and understand what happened to this patient in this duration of this trial, and how can, we best use that to optimize their care moving forward. And so I think that that's also, and presenting it in a way that is understandable and it's digestible to a patient, and presenting what is actually important to them. For example, like if I was presented with data about, what my heart rate is, or, my versus my blood oxygen levels, I know they're pretty similar, but obviously the blood oxygen levels is really important because that measures like how much whether my lungs are moving the oxygen around in my body or not effectively. And so like that would be really important to me. Lung function, maybe in my case specifically, it wouldn't be, but how far I was able to walk on any given day, so it's like tailoring this information maybe to what is most meaningful to a specific patient or population. And then again, maintaining that relationship long term, because they may, if a patient had a positive experience in a trial, then they may want to participate again in the future. And then you already have, for future recruitment efforts, you already have that established relationship, and they may be more likely to, do another trial in the future. And that ultimately just helps to advance science and research.
Yeah, there's very good points about tailoring and sharing back data. I think that's reflected very often by what patients say after a trial and what they hope to get out of it. Maybe one question here that I know you're passionate about as well is, how do we get trust and awareness to, populations or communities which have deep distrust in pharma and in maybe medical research in general?
Yeah, I mean, I really think it starts from a grassroots level. You have to build industry has to build the relationship with the local and community physicians, the people that are in communities that individuals care about and who they trust now, there is existing trust with. And so I think that it requires, supporting various programming and initiatives from a community level so that there can be some of that awareness brought to what these companies are doing, what research is happening. Because when you just try to reach somebody, online or even via, various other advocacy organizations, if those patients don't really have a connection to those organizations anyway, or if they, there's a lot of things that go around online that you can't trust. We always get just like pop-up ads and things like that. So it's like it has to be from a human to human relationship and connection. So I think that's what's a really important focus, is that in order to start with these, building these trusting relationships, it means that you have to gain the trust of people, maybe leaders of those communities, and and physicians within those communities, because that's who individuals trust the most. And this is obviously, now we're speaking to underrepresented populations, but I think that this is true and relevant to our society or individuals as a whole. Like, we feel close to and trust people that we share a lot about ourselves too, and we have a relationship with, and so that's who we're gonna want to gravitate toward and trust that person. So if that's how this information is being funneled, or this relationship is slowly being integrated, then that's going to be the most valuable.
Thank you, Ella. It's been a really good discussion. And one thing is, many of our listeners to this podcast are people working exactly in clinical trials and medical research. And so I'm sure they will value a lot of this insight. Do you have any words of thought or wisdom for them?
Yeah, I think my final takeaway would be, twofold. It's keeping empathy for the patient's experience and then humanizing the experience of living with a disease or a condition, and keeping that at the forefront of all that is done within clinical trials, within healthcare as a whole, is what's going to then facilitate and is going to then help to support the most patient-centric and patient-engaged initiatives and treatments and trials, because the aim is to help other humans in the best way that we can. So that's kind of an overarching, I think, thing to keep in mind throughout the work that everybody does in the healthcare space. And then, of course, we've touched on this a lot, but it's engaging early. It's bringing in patient voices early, giving them a seat at the table. It's not that patients are not just in the center. A lot of times we think about patients just being in the center and then healthcare revolves around, but we are sitting around the table with everybody else. We're a piece of this ecosystem, and it's, treat us as such. Treat us as individuals who want to gain understanding to improve our own health and want to contribute to improving the health of others and want to see treatments succeed and come and move into development. And so I think that's a good way to view it as well. And that combined with empathy for this experience will hopefully get us to a point in care and research moving forward where we can find treatments and cure many conditions.
Yeah, you've just summarized co-design in a great image there of the seat at a table. So thank you for your time and thank you for the inspirational examples.
Thank you.
And
Thanks for
thoughts.
having me.